Good evening, everyone, and I really am so honored to be here. I want to particularly thank Dean Fitzpatrick and the wonderful gift of the Natrell family to support this lectureship. These are really, really important contributions, and certainly Dean Fitzpatrick's leadership has touched all of us in many, many ways. So I'm delighted to look out and see so many students here because it gives me a little bit of hope about our future. And as we spend our time together tonight, I really invite you to consider what brought you to this wonderful profession of ours. What was it that drew you to nursing? Because in many ways, the answer to that question is a resource for how we will navigate, how you will navigate the inevitable ethical issues that will come up in practice. That resource of remembering why we're here can really support us when we're confused, when we are conflicted, and when we're not sure about which way to go. So I want to just begin by grounding us in that. As I look at these pictures, many of them represent children that I've cared for, and they certainly are the reason that I do the work that I do, are the people that we serve. So what brings us together? Well, one thing that brings us together is that we're really all here trying to do important work under really challenging circumstances. And I would suspect that we all have a shared commitment to make a difference in the lives of the people we serve, to relieve suffering, to benefit them. And every one of us in this room is a leader in one way or another, whatever our scope of influence is. And so as we think about how we will leverage that opportunity as a leader, it's important for us to think about what ethics actually means in the context of our work. And I'd like to share how I think about ethics. Often ethics is reduced to a cognitive process where we analyze and we debate different viewpoints. But actually, ethics is embedded in everything that we do. It's a reflection of our behavior, the choices we make, our intentions, and ultimately our character. So when we think of ethics as the add-on, we're missing an important opportunity to think about how do I actually bring who I really am into every moment of what I do. In a broad sense, our ethics, our principles, our values really do guide our behavior and provides us with important reasons for why we do what we do. So Isabel Hampton Robb is part of the Hopkins legacy, and she was the first superintendent at Johns Hopkins. And one of the little-known facts about Isabel Hampton Robb is she actually wrote the first nursing ethics textbook in the United States. I didn't realize this for a while, but it makes sense in terms of our commitment to ethics in our work at Hopkins. And she's left us with some very wise words, I think. Nurses are trusted with the most precious thing on earth, the life, health, and happiness of other human beings. So if we take that as part of our work, it's important for us to think about, well, what are some of the ethical issues that keep us up at night as nurses? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about a project that we embarked on that looked at some of these issues. But before I do that, I want you to hear directly from some of my nursing colleagues about what keeps them up at night.
I think what keeps me up at night most is when we have patients that I can't help with the system that we have established. And so I think in terms of research, it's your data, that are
really critical. And so making sure that there aren't any breaches in terms of your data, in terms of confidentiality, keeping everything very secure.
Providers often are unsure how to prognosticate or to predict how infants will do in the long run. So giving information to parents can be really difficult.
And the other issue that really bothers me is health disparities. A lot of things play into what happens when you get health care. I think that there are a lot of other things that go into it. For example, the concept of cultural competence. We can talk about being culturally sensitive, we can talk about working in a multicultural environment, but really cultural competence to me is something that you strive for. You don't get there. There's no way in the world I'm going to be culturally competent with all the cultures that come through here. But I do have to be able to recognize that I need to ask people what it is they need, listen for the unspoken things, and work toward making sure that they get what they need on their terms, not mine, theirs.
Just that we come to the work prepared to see pain and suffering. And so there are times when it seems like too much, it probably is too much.
We have a lot of technology in cardiac surgery, and we use that to save people's lives. But sometimes the patient doesn't necessarily want all of that technology, and sometimes they express that, especially to nurses, I think, at the bedside. Or sometimes they will express it to them, but what they say to their family or to the interdisciplinary team is different. And they agree to certain things because they think their family or their significant others want them to do that, or the team thinks they should do that, but it's not necessarily what they want.
The reason it's prolonging suffering is that I think we all know that it will inevitably end in death, and we're just really prolonging the inevitable, and that is very ethically challenging and very draining to take care of those kinds of patients, and those are the kinds of patients where you leave just feeling very sad and like you really didn't help them, you just hurt them.
And with all that going on, sometimes I think it's easier just to not deal with the ethical issues to avoid going there. And it takes a lot of courage to bring up topics that nobody wants to talk about.
I think that one of the things that we seem to see as a challenge that maybe keeps coming up is when the team itself, our whole team, isn't on the same page. We don't have a consensus of how to treat those patients. We do genetic terminations.
I think the primary one is the issue of HIV disclosure. So disclosure of positive status.
People's main focus is, what can we do to keep this child alive? What is everything that needs to be done to keep this child alive? Rather than, if we keep this child alive, what quality of life will he or she experience? And if he or she will not have any quality of life, then what can we do to address the needs of a child in a way that is compassionate and humane?
That things keep me up at night when I don't feel I can deliver safe, effective, patient-centered care. If I'm not able to help them in the best possible way I can, it really does. It breaks your heart.
So, if you're a nursing student, depending on your clinical experience so far, you may have already identified some ethical issues that keep you up at night. Ethical issues are really part of our work as nurses, and it's not something that's going to go away. And so one of the issues is, how do we think about ethics in the context of our future? So you're probably all familiar with the Future of Nursing report, which was an incredible report talking about the opportunities for nurses to really serve at their highest potential, to be involved in many aspects of healthcare redesign. But what was missing in the report was a clear grounding in our ethical foundation. And so in response to that, last August, we hosted at Johns Hopkins a National Nursing Ethics Summit. And from that, we created a blueprint for 21st century nursing ethics. What we did is we invited representatives from all the major nursing organizations. We had 9 strategic partners, including the American Nurses Association, Sigma Theta Tau, the American Academy of Nursing, critical care nurses, and many others, thinking that one of the ways for us to begin to integrate and make sure that ethics is really woven into the fabric of our future is to engage our professional organizations. We also invited 20 nurse ethicists who had really focused on many of these issues in their own practice and work. And through that process, we created recommendations focusing on clinical practice, education, policy, and research. And one of the outcomes of that process was we created a pledge that we asked all of our strategic partners to endorse. And this was the pledge: that ethics is a critical part of everyday nursing practice, that nurses in all roles and specialties must have the knowledge, skills, and tools to uphold their professional values, and that we collectively pledge to support and safeguard those professional values of nurses and all healthcare professionals, and to work together to strengthen a culture where everyone is able to practice ethically. So this pledge, actually since the time that we launched the report, has been endorsed by 60 additional nursing organizations. And I think what it suggests is that it is a critical time, for us to come back to our roots and to acknowledge that ethics is embedded in everyday nursing practice. It's not separate from, it is part of everything that we do. And at the same time, this initiative coincided with the revision of the ANA Code of Ethics, which, as you all know, is really the roadmap for ethical practice for the profession. The 9 provisions and the interpretive statements really are the grounding for nursing ethics. So the fact that we had the summit and the revision of the ANA Code created the opportunity to declare 2015 the Year of Ethics. But it's important for us to go beyond just knowing what those 9 provisions are and to be aware of what our responsibility and accountability is to uphold and live those values in everyday practice. So what's at stake in our work? And I think from an ethical perspective, there are many ethical values that we confront. And if you listen to the themes in the nurses who spoke in the video, there were issues like reverence for life and human dignity, honoring people's values, promoting well-being and comfort and quality of life. We always are balancing that with minimizing suffering and harm. And similarly, the issue of justice, the question of non-discrimination. The very first provision of our ANA Code of Ethics says that nurses care for every person, regardless of any characteristic, that we take care of everyone. And that is a very rigorous obligation when you think about how diverse we are and how different we may see the world. And in the end, I think what we're trying to accomplish is integrity for the patient, the family, the profession, the organization. When ethical issues aren't addressed, what we know is that moral distress occurs. And as someone who has spent a lot of time thinking about this issue, at one time I thought maybe we could actually extinguish it. I've come to the conclusion it's not going to happen. It's part of our work. It will happen. And the question is, what do we do about it? So moral distress is that anguish, that sense of despair that we often feel when we recognize, first of all, there's a moral problem. Secondly, that we have responsibility to do something about it. And we go through a process of reasoning what would be the correct thing to do, but we're unable to act on it. So it's the difference between recognizing it, knowing what we want to do, but not being able to actually do it in the end. And the distress is in response to either challenges, threats, or violations of our integrity. That's where the real rub comes when we experience moral distress. This concept of moral distress has been studied very extensively in nursing, and this concept came from a philosopher, Andy Jameson, back in the 1970s, who wrote one of our first nursing ethics textbooks. We studied it a lot, and here are some of the data. 1 in 3 nurses experience moral distress. They experience medium to high levels of moral distress on a regular basis. What's interesting is the intensity of moral distress is often more than the frequency. What that means is, even though it doesn't happen every day, when it does happen, it often has a very profound effect on the people who are involved. We also know that nurses leave their positions and sometimes the profession because of moral distress. And over time, their integrity is eroded and can begin to show up in a whole variety of behaviors. Detachment being one, but also abandonment, numbing, where people really shut down. They're not able to actually engage empathically with their patients. And we also know that the effect of moral distress can accumulate. It can, after many experiences of it, continue to increase, come back to a little bit of relief, but then continue to escalate, doesn't really go away. And that can have a negative effect on our workplace environment. So what do we do with this? We could, on the one hand, see ourselves as victims. We could see ourselves as disempowered and powerless to change anything. Or we could see moral distress actually as evidence of our moral commitment, not as a failure, which is often the narrative that we have when we talk about moral distress. We talk about how we failed, and yet the reason we feel distress is because we feel a threat or a violation of very important values. So one way to think about the way forward is to consider, what would integrity require of us? What does integrity mean to you? What is that sense of being whole? What does that look like? So if you look in the literature, there's lots of definitions of integrity. Wholeness and harmony, being honest and sincere, living your values rather than just talking about them, doing what's right even when it's difficult, and acting sometimes even at personal cost. Another definition of integrity comes from a Japanese calligrapher and translator, Kaz Tanahashi. From looking at it from the translation from Japanese, his definition was whole oneness. Integrity means that we are interconnected, and we have an interconnection with each other that makes us all part of the human community. So when one of us is out of integrity, we all are impacted. So personal integrity may be one of the ways that we begin to think about how do we mitigate the impact of moral distress. How do we act in ways that are actually congruent with our values? And align what we do and what we say, what we sanction, what we allow to happen or what we don't allow to happen. And be intentional about how we might actually act with integrity. One of the elements of being able to act with integrity is being able to notice when you actually are in integrity. So just for a moment, think about a time when you actually lived your values. And pay attention as you think about that. What do you notice in terms of your own response? In your bodies, in your emotions, in your thoughts? Because recognizing the place of integrity gives us a home place to come back to when we're not sure, when our integrity is actually challenged. We all know how hard it is to act with integrity. And there are lots of things that challenge our integrity. Sometimes it's when we do things on a kind of arbitrary or capricious way, when we are alienated from our convictions, when we can't seem to connect to what really matters, when we ignore the signals of our conscience. And we all know what that feels like, right? It's when your mother knows something that you've done that you are denying that you're doing. Anybody have any of those? You know, like your mother was sitting here, she probably would know some things that you wish she didn't, or you haven't told her. Things like that over time we sometimes ignore when our gut is telling us that there's danger or we've violated something important, or we start rationalizing what we do. Some of the reasons why we're more vulnerable to lapses of integrity are when we are really exhausted. And as students, and I'm sure you're not much different than my students at Hopkins, being exhausted is a pretty common experience, physically, emotionally, and sometimes spiritually. So stress can also impact our ability to act with integrity. When our amygdala gets hijacked, you know that experience where, you know, we're no longer able to actually act with intention, but we're kind of in autopilot in a very stressful situation where fear shows up, where sometimes our ego gets in the way, or there's peer pressure, or we're actually just going through the motions. So those are all situations that may make us vulnerable to lapses in integrity. Being able to notice and know what are the things that make us vulnerable helps us to regain our integrity when we find ourselves in situations where we have to make difficult choices. Because we know that lapses in integrity, like moral distress, affect our whole being. They affect our physical health, our emotional health, spiritually, as well as behaviorally. And often it creates what we have described as a moral residue. It's the leftover, the residue that we carry when we've actually compromised ourselves or allowed ourselves to be compromised. When this happens, we suffer. And so part of our goal here is to create a vision where we can, in these situations where integrity may be challenged, where we can restore integrity and actually cultivate moral resilience. So you might be wondering, what is moral resilience anyway? We talk about resilience a lot in our patients. We want them to be more resilient. But moral resilience actually refers to the capacity of a person, of an individual, to sustain or restore their integrity in response to complexity, confusion, distress, and setbacks. So we're taking this from the point of view of moral resilience is also important in our sort of integrity frame. In thinking about physical resilience or emotional resilience, moral resilience is part of that. And what we're aiming for here is to create what my colleague Lori Leach calls the resilient zone. This is that place where when we're confronted with difficult things, we're able to respond to them in a balanced way. We are able to regulate our emotional responses. In contrast to what happens when we experience moral distress is we get bumped out of our resilient zone. And when that happens, usually one of two things happens. we end up in hyperarousal, which looks like irritability, kind of a hypervigilance, rage, nightmare kind of very highly charged responses. Or on the other hand, which is equally out of the resilient zone, is hypoarousal, which looks like depression, disconnection, exhaustion, fatigue, numbness. So it's either one of those ends of the continuum that demonstrate that we're out of our resilient zone. And you probably, if you think about it, you've probably been on both ends of this spectrum at one time or another. The time when you feel like there's so much heavy stuff in your backpack that you just really can't walk around, that sense of fatigue and exhaustion, or when you are just manic, trying to respond to whatever challenge is in front of you. In this sense, what we're looking for in terms of moral resilience is the ability to begin to self-regulate and to become aware when we are out of our resilient zone. And to do that, we need to develop capacities to notice ourselves, to notice what's happening in our bodies as clues to what might help us to regain that sense of balance. We can also be mindful and aware of our feelings and emotions, noticing what kind of patterns we carry in response to challenging situations, where maybe we're confused, or maybe we're really in conflict about what's the right thing to do. We can also be aware of our thoughts and attitudes and the patterns that we have. I'll give you an example of that. So I started my career in the pediatric ICU. And since that time, I have ended up doing a lot of ethics consultation in critical care units. And there's often a common theme about certain kinds of patients. Patients who have had many surgeries, who have many organ systems that are failing. And people ask the question over and over again, why are we doing this? Why are we doing this? And along with that is a narrative that is a thought pattern. We shouldn't be doing this. This is just like Mr. Jones that was here last week, and he ended up in either a really prolonged stay or he died. And the thought pattern is very, very consistent. So we want to notice those patterns. Notice what the narrative is. What do we tell ourselves? And how we can then notice it, not to necessarily judge ourselves, but to be able to see if we can shift it. So how do we do that? Well, lots of different ways. Essentially, anything that brings us to a place of stillness. Because when we are in overdrive, as we often are, and I have to say, I'm so impressed that you're not all on your electronic devices. I'm really, really impressed. Because one of the main distractors, I know some of you are, one of the main distractors is technology overload. And there's a myth that we can multitask. The neuroscience tells us our brain can only hold on to one thing at a time. So when you think you're multitasking, you're actually just exhausting yourself. Wonder why we're all so tired? Right? So anything that helps us to focus our attention, to be able to still our nervous system, to know when our nervous system has gone wonky and bring ourselves back to a more balanced state. That could be mindfulness-based stress reduction, meditation, prayer. It could be mind training in the form of biofeedback or neural feedback, insight practices, movement practices like yoga and Tai Chi. It doesn't really matter what it is, but that we find a practice that helps us find that still point. And I'm going to ask you to do something right now. I want you to put your feet on the floor if you feel comfortable. And I'd like you to, if you can, to find your pulse, either at your wrist or at your neck, and just for a moment to, if you feel like it, you can just close your eyes even for a minute. But find your pulse. And as you find your pulse, I want you to notice how you are right now. Just take a quick scan of your body. See if you can locate any place that feels tight, any place that's uncomfortable. And just notice how you are. Notice your breathing as you bring air through your nose into your lungs and your chest expands. And notice what it feels like to allow that breath to flow out of your body as you exhale. Notice underneath your fingers, your heart beating, your pulse. Notice the quality of your pulse. Is it bounding? Is it weaker? What's the rate? Is it fast? Is it slow? Notice the rhythm. Is it regular? Is it irregular? And just for a moment, reflect on the miracle that your heart beats without any instigation on your part. Hundreds and hundreds of times every day. And as we complete this, send a little gratitude to that muscle in your chest that beats over and over and over again. So now I want you to just notice how you are. This is more of our native state than the upregulated, phonetic way that we are most of the time. And it's actually from this place of being grounded and still that we can perceive things clearly, that we can inquire more purposefully and intentionally into the questions that we need to answer. And it's really from this place that we need to consider how we care for ourselves, because all of you in this room are a scarce resource. And you need to realize that as a scarce resource, when you're no longer among us, we have lost something very, very important. And the patients that you will care for and would have cared for will suffer as a result. So we must invest in ourselves so that we can be morally resilient, invest in our own well-being, and to use that as a resource to help us actually serve at our highest capacity. Integrity in this context requires us to really explore who you are and what you stand for, which is different from what you stand against. What you stand against arises from a negative energy. What you stand for arises from those deep values of possibility. Moral resilience also requires us to continue to inquire into our points of view, to be willing to examine whether or not our beliefs and our attitudes are true, and whether or not there are occasions when we might need to make revisions. I'm not suggesting that we ought to all abandon our values, but it is the case that some of the things that we think we value, we haven't fully explored their meaning, their impact, and whether or not we actually want to continue to adopt them. So being morally resilient means that we're open to that kind of exploration. It also requires us to walk the talk. It's easy to talk about values, and most of us hear a lot of rhetoric about values. But how do you actually live your values? Doing the right thing when no one's watching, and being willing to speak up and speak out when important values are actually threatened. That isn't a skill that comes easy for us when we experience moral outrage. But if we can ground ourselves, we're more likely to communicate from a place of wisdom rather than reaction. And we've seen all over the country students who are speaking up about concerns that they have, some of them in very respectful ways, and others in ways that are actually very disrespectful and harmful to others. So speaking with integrity doesn't mean that you can spew your point of view in a hateful way. Integrity requires us to speak about that in a way it can be heard, where it's coherent, where it's grounded, and where it demonstrates in that expression the integrity, the meaning, and the intention that we have. And that is not easy for us when we feel so deeply and strongly about values and points of view that we hold. But moral resilience requires us to be able to learn how to navigate through those difficult situations, to find that voice, and to be responsible and accountable for our own inactions, how we speak about and how we engage in addressing those issues. I think another aspect of moral resilience is to begin to listen more carefully to the call of conscience. In many ways, I feel like our conscience has become very dampened. And we've normalized situations that we need to be speaking up about. The call of conscience means that in this space of noticing, we pay attention when our conscience starts to quiver. And we begin to inquire into that and to pay attention to it, to guide us so that we can figure out when we need to act and how we need to act. And that requires us to not dismiss when our gut starts rumbling and we know that there is something we need to pay attention to really pay attention. And to use that as a source of discernment in the process of deciding how we are going to be. The other element here in moral resilience is being able to know when we have exerted enough effort. So I look out at all of you, and you're at the beginning of your career. I'm an old nurse now. I've been in the field for a good long time. And this is a lesson I've had to struggle with, because I'm an optimist, and I think if we just work a little harder, we can just fix these things. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes we have to be able to discern when we have recognized a problem, an ethical problem that needs attention. We have committed ourselves to trying to find solutions. But we are not also called to be martyrs. And there's a personal threshold we have to know: when have I exerted enough effort? And when is it time for me to change my responses? And it might be that we need to consider various ways that we respond to threats to integrity. Sometimes it's possible to compromise without really threatening who we are and what we stand for. There are times when we need to speak up and speak out. Sometimes we need to say no We need to conscientiously refuse to participate in things that are wrong. Sometimes, in very discrete and rare circumstances, we need to take public action in whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is an act often of conscience, but it is an act that must be informed very carefully to understand the consequences and the risk of doing so. But it is, in some instances, the thing that needs to be done. And finally, the last one is sometimes we need to remove ourselves from situations that repeatedly compromise our integrity so that we can, as one of my nursing colleagues told me today, she said, I was asked to do something that I felt would really compromise my integrity as a nursing leader. And I know that the consequences may lead to changing the trajectory of my professional career. But I know at the end of the day that no matter what happens, I did the right thing. And I can live with that image of myself. So to me, that represents moral courage, to befriend that fear, to see it, and to act in spite of it. So we need courage in our profession. We need courageous nurses to stand up, to speak out, to be able to do that in a balanced way, and to do it in a way that is really ethically grounded, so that we can preserve this very important core of our profession. So in the 21st century, when we look to the future, we have our moral compass to guide us. We're not just rudderless with no idea how we ought to move or how we ought to behave. And so thinking about 21st century nursing ethics, it's an opportunity for us to really consider what integrity requires of us. How can we begin to cultivate these capacities for moral resilience so that no matter what we're confronted with, we can see the opportunities. We can begin to really take the opportunity in each moment to see how we are behaving. How am I being in this moment? To commit to action. What's one thing you can begin to do to make ethical practice routine? How can you work with others to begin to really solidify a culture of ethical practice that allows you to practice with integrity? And that means all of us, old nurses and new nurses, need to stand together to address these important issues. I want to leave you with a mnemonic that was created by Roshi Joan Halifax based on a model of compassion. And this simple mnemonic, GRACE, is a tool that you can use when you're confronted with an ethically challenging situation. The G of GRACE is to gather your attention, to take a few deep breaths, to really center and downregulate your nervous system. The R of GRACE is to recall your intention. Why are you really here? What is it that brought you to this profession and to this work? A is to attune first to yourself. Before you speak and before you act, notice what's happening in you. And then attune to the other and to see how you can attune to what might be going on to the person you're talking with. If it's a patient, if it's a colleague, if it's an administrator, tuning in to the other. The C of GRACE is to consider what will really serve. This is different from getting what you want. Considering what will really serve is inquiring into what would be the most helpful, beneficial thing that I could do right now. And the E of GRACE is ethically enacting, going from knowing what to do to actually doing it in a way that preserves integrity. So this mnemonic of GRACE can happen in just a few moments. It can happen as you put your hand on the door to open the room to your patient. It can happen as you're washing your hands, to create a way for you to have pauses in your day, pauses in the process where you can reconnect to why you're here and doing what you're called to do. I want to leave you with this quote by Emerson. It is one of the most beautiful compensations in this life that no man can sincerely try to help another without helping himself. So if we approach our work from the place of integrity, our intentions to serve others, to relieve suffering, and to commit to practices that help us to be morally resilient, I think the future looks very bright, because I look at all of you in this room and I see promise. I see possibility. And I look forward to hearing the very common examples of how you've acted with integrity and how you've navigated your career in nursing. Thank you all for being here, and thank you for your work.